You have been carrying a heavy kind of exhaustion that does not come from ordinary heartbreak. It comes from trying to make sense of something that was never meant to make sense. You gave your time, your patience, and your genuine care, and instead of being met with reciprocity, you were met with confusion, distance, and a quiet kind of erasure. You may have spent months, maybe years, asking yourself what you did wrong, replaying conversations, searching for the moment everything shifted, and wondering why someone who seemed so invested could walk away as if nothing mattered. That exhaustion is real, and it is valid. It is not a sign of weakness. It is the natural result of giving your truth to someone who is operating from a different emotional reality. You were not the problem. The imbalance was never about your worth, your effort, or your capacity to love. It was about a dynamic that required you to bend so someone else could remain steady. What you are experiencing is the aftermath of emotional manipulation, even when it was quiet, even when it wore a gentle face. The confusion you feel is not because you failed to understand love. It is because you were asked to hold a relationship together while the foundation was shifting beneath your feet. You adapted to survive the instability. You learned to manage your own reactions to keep the peace. That takes a toll, and it is completely normal to feel drained when the dust finally settles. When someone with strong narcissistic traits loses a partner who truly loved them, they do not experience loss in the way you might expect. Genuine love requires vulnerability, accountability, and the willingness to be seen. Those things are deeply threatening to a person who has built their identity around control and image. The main psychological truth here is simple. It is not about you leaving. It is about what your presence provided and what your absence exposes. Your steady love acted as an emotional regulator. It soothed insecurities, validated their narrative, and kept a fragile sense of self intact without them having to face it directly. When that source of steady affection disappears, the structure they relied on begins to crack. They do not grieve you as a whole person. They grieve the function you served. They grieve the quiet certainty that someone believed in them, accommodated their shifts, and absorbed their emotional weight. That is why the recovery you are looking for will not come. They are not losing a partner. They are losing a source of external regulation. And regulation cannot be replaced by another person in a healthy way. It can only be replaced by new sources of attention, new cycles of validation, new people who will temporarily fill the same role. The inability to recover is not a mystery. It is a direct result of a system that depends on outside management instead of internal grounding. They do not know how to sit with their own emotions, so they rely on others to carry them. When the person carrying that weight steps away, the void remains. Look at how this dynamic actually works in practice. When you are with someone who struggles with narcissistic patterns, affection is rarely consistent. It arrives when it serves a purpose, and it withdraws when it no longer feels necessary. You learn to read subtle shifts in tone, changes in availability, and quiet withdrawals of warmth. You adapt. You try to be more patient, more understanding, more accommodating, believing that if you just show enough consistency, the connection will stabilize. That is exactly what happens in this kind of relationship. Your stability becomes the anchor, and their instability becomes the current. The behavior you experienced was not random. It was a pattern of taking emotional support when needed, then creating distance when the support felt too demanding or too revealing. Psychologically, this happens because genuine intimacy requires mutual exposure. It requires both people to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge mistakes, and to share responsibility for the emotional climate. When one person cannot tolerate that exposure, they manage it through control. They manage it by deciding when closeness happens, when distance is appropriate, and who carries the emotional weight. The effect on you is a quiet kind of depletion. You stop trusting your own perception. You begin to question whether your needs are reasonable, whether your reactions are exaggerated, whether you are simply too sensitive. That self-doubt is not a reflection of your character. It is the natural outcome of being placed in a role where your reality is constantly adjusted to fit someone else's comfort. You were not broken by this. You were worn down by a system that asked you to carry more than your share. The deeper reason recovery becomes impossible lies in what true love actually represents to someone operating from this place. Real love is not just affection. It is accountability. It is the willingness to be known, flaws included, and still choose connection. For a person who relies on external validation to manage internal shame, that kind of love feels like a threat. It does not feel like safety. It feels like exposure. Your genuine care did not just comfort them, it reminded them, on a level they could not articulate, that they were seen. And being seen without the filter of performance is difficult when your self-worth depends on being admired or needed. When you leave, or when the relationship ends, they do not face a simple separation. They face the sudden absence of the emotional buffer that kept their defenses intact. The behavior that follows is often a frantic search for replacement, or a cold withdrawal into detachment. Sometimes it looks like immediate replacement with someone new. Sometimes it looks like complete silence. Both serve the same purpose. They are attempts to restore control over the emotional environment. They are attempts to prove that the loss does not matter, that the connection was never that deep, that they are still in charge of how the story ends. This happens because the alternative is facing a quiet, uncomfortable truth. The truth that their version of love was never about mutual exchange. It was about management. It was about keeping themselves regulated without having to change. The effect on you during this time is often a deep sense of disorientation. You watch someone who seemed so connected suddenly act as if you never existed. You feel the whiplash between the warmth you experienced and the coldness that follows. That whiplash is not about you losing value. It is about them protecting a fragile identity by severing the tie to the one person who knew them too well. You are left holding the weight of a reality they refuse to acknowledge, and that is why the closure you seek will never come from them. Closure in this situation is not given. It is built. You do not need them to explain themselves for your experience to be real. The confusion you carry is not a puzzle you failed to solve. It is evidence that you were operating from honesty while they were operating from survival. They survived by keeping you close enough to benefit from your care and distant enough to avoid accountability. That pattern does not change when the relationship ends. It only shifts form. You will notice it in the way they rewrite history, in the way they minimize what happened, in the way they present themselves as the injured party while leaving the actual emotional damage unaddressed. None of this is about your failure to be enough. It is about their inability to sit with the discomfort of genuine connection. Recognizing this is not about bitterness. It is about clarity. When you stop looking for the missing piece in their explanation, you begin to see the pattern clearly. You see how your empathy was used as a tool for regulation, how your patience was interpreted as permission, how your love was absorbed rather than reciprocated. You start to understand that stepping back is not an act of punishment. It is an act of self-preservation. You do not need to convince them of what happened. You only need to acknowledge it for yourself. The moment you stop trying to fix the unfixable, your mind begins to settle. The noise fades. The questions lose their urgency. You realize that peace does not require their understanding. It requires your acceptance of what was real. From that place of clarity, you begin to rebuild your boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are quiet lines that protect your energy and your sense of reality. They look like stepping away from circular conversations that lead nowhere. They look like refusing to engage when the goal is only to draw you back into old patterns. They look like choosing silence over explanation when silence is the clearest answer. Calm detachment is not indifference. It is the decision to stop pouring your truth into a space that cannot hold it. It is the understanding that you cannot reason someone out of a system they did not build with reason. You protect your peace by removing yourself from the cycle of trying to prove your worth to someone who measures worth only by what it can provide for them. Self-respect returns when you stop negotiating with your own needs. It returns when you choose consistency over chaos, when you stop accepting small gestures as proof of deep care, when you recognize that love that requires you to shrink is not love. It is control wearing a gentle mask. You do not need to announce your boundaries. You simply live them. You step away from the need for validation that drains you. You redirect your energy toward relationships that operate on mutual respect, where your presence is valued without conditions, where your emotions are not treated as inconveniences, where your honesty is met with honesty. That is where real connection begins, not in the space of trying to fix what was broken, but in the space of choosing what is whole. Healing does not arrive as a sudden event. It arrives as a series of quiet decisions. It arrives when you stop waiting for an apology that will never come and start giving yourself the understanding you deserved all along. It arrives when you stop measuring your worth by how much someone else could tolerate your depth and start recognizing that your depth is exactly what makes you capable of real love. You were never the problem.
You were the person who showed up fully, who offered consistency, who believed in connection, even when it was not returned in the same way. That capacity is yours to keep. It does not disappear because someone else could not hold it. It only needs a safer place to rest. Moving forward means accepting that some people are not equipped for the kind of love you offer, and that this is not a reflection of your value. It is a reflection of their limitations. You do not need to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were never built for you. You do not need to explain your boundaries to people who only understand control. You simply step away, rebuild your sense of reality, and allow yourself to heal at a steady pace. Peace comes when you stop trying to make sense of what was never meant to make sense, and start trusting your own perception again. Strength comes when you choose yourself without guilt, when you honor your exhaustion without shame, when you recognize that walking away from emotional imbalance is not failure. It is clarity. You will carry this experience with you, but it will not define you. It will simply remind you of what you are capable of and what you no longer have to tolerate. The path forward is quiet, but it is yours. You do not need permission to leave what drains you. You do not need validation to choose peace. You only need to trust that the love you gave was real, even if it was not returned in the same way, and that the love you will receive next will not ask you to lose yourself in the process. You are already enough. You always were. The only thing left to do is to live like it.